Imagine walking out into a blinding blizzard. The wind feels like crushed glass against your cheeks. The temperature is hovering somewhere around -40 degrees, and the snow is already waist-deep. Now, take away your heavy, insulated parka. Strip off those thermal base layers. Toss your waterproof boots into a snowbank, and forget about the GPS in your pocket or the heated car waiting for you a mile down the road. All you have is a brain that won't stop racing, a few rocks you've chipped into sharp edges, and the sheer, stubborn will to keep your heart beating. This isn't the plot of an extreme wilderness survival show. For our ancient human ancestors living through the peak of the Ice Age, this wasn't a nightmare scenario. This was just Tuesday. Welcome to the deep freeze. Specifically, we're talking about a brutal climatic epoch that peaked roughly 20,000 years ago. Geologists call it the last glacial maximum, but we can just call it the darkest, longest, most punishing winter humanity has ever faced. During this time, massive, crushing sheets of ice, some of them 2 miles thick, crawled down over huge portions of North America, Europe, and Asia. The planet was so locked up in frozen water that global sea levels plummeted by over 400 feet. It was a completely different, almost alien Earth. And right in the middle of it was us, Homo sapiens. We were, and still are, a species of relatively fragile, sweaty, hairless bipeds that originally evolved to jog across the sun-drenched savannas of Africa. When you really think about it, dropping a tropical primate into a frozen, apocalyptic wasteland makes about as much sense as taking a sports car to a tractor pull. We had absolutely no business surviving out there. The animals we shared this frozen world with were custom-built for the extreme cold. You had the woolly mammoths, which were essentially massive, walking fortresses wrapped in thick layers of fat and shaggy fur. You had woolly rhinos, cave bears the size of minivans, and dire wolves roaming the frozen tundra. Nature had equipped them with heavy-duty biological winter coats and metabolisms specifically designed to hoard heat. And what did we have? Bare skin that loses heat faster than a cracked window in December, and a total lack of natural armor, venom, or deadly claws. We couldn't outrun most of the predators. We couldn't wrestle a cave bear, and we certainly couldn't just stand out in the snow and wait out the storm. To survive, we had to cheat. We had to use the ultimate loophole in the rules of natural selection, our minds. The first and most crucial way we hacked our survival wasn't just finding shelter, it was mastering a piece of technology that we completely take for granted today: fire. Now, you might be picturing a cartoon caveman grunting and clumsily rubbing 2 sticks together just to warm his hands. But the reality of ancient human fire use was far more sophisticated and way more intentional than that. Fire wasn't just a makeshift heater. It was our very first multi-tool. It kept the frostbite at bay, sure, but it also kept those minivan-sized cave bears out of our sleeping areas. Predators have an instinctual, hardwired terror of flames. By building strategic hearths, our ancestors created invisible, glowing force fields around their camps. But they went even further. They didn't just use fire to survive the night. They used it for chemical engineering. Archaeologists have discovered that ancient humans were actually heat-treating their rocks. If you take certain types of stone, like silkrete, and bury them under a fire at just the right temperature for just the right amount of time, the internal structure of the stone fundamentally changes. It becomes easier to flake, allowing a skilled toolmaker to chip away edges that are sharper than modern surgical steel. Without access to modern metalworking, our ancestors used fire to literally upgrade the earth beneath their feet, creating the lethal spear points and skinning knives they desperately needed to survive. And then, of course, there was the ultimate biological hack: cooking. When temperatures plunge into the negatives, your body burns through calories at a terrifying rate just to maintain a core temperature of 98.6 degrees. Eating raw food takes a massive amount of metabolic energy to digest. By cooking their meat and tough foraged roots over the fire, ancient humans essentially pre-digested their meals. Sopisan cooking broke down the tough proteins and complex carbohydrates before the food even hit their stomachs, meaning our bodies could extract maximum calories with minimal effort. That extra energy didn't just go toward keeping our toes warm, it fueled the most energy-hungry organ we possess, the human brain. We were using fire to feed the very engine of our ingenuity, an engine that was about to solve the next massive problem of the Ice Age: how to survive a landscape that offered nowhere to hide. When we think of prehistoric humans, the first word that usually comes to mind is caveman. It's a stubborn image. We picture our ancestors huddled together in dark, damp limestone caverns, staring out at the driving snow, waiting for the weather to clear. But there is a massive logical flaw in that picture. Think about a sprawling, flat, frozen tundra, much like the steppes of modern-day Russia or the plains of northern Europe during the last glacial maximum. There simply weren't enough caves to go around. And even when a nomadic tribe did manage to find a prime piece of cave real estate, chances are a giant, angry cave bear was already hibernating inside, and they weren't exactly keen on sharing a lease. So, if you are out on the open ice steppes, blasted by freezing, hurricane-force winds, and there are absolutely no natural rock shelters to hide in, what do? You become an architect. Our ancestors couldn't just harvest timber and build a log cabin because the extreme, persistent cold had wiped out most of the trees. Instead, they looked around at the desolate, frozen landscape and utilized the only building material that was available in massive abundance: the skeletons of giants. In places like modern-day Ukraine, archaeologists have unearthed some of the most jaw-dropping prehistoric structures ever found. Massive, complex huts, built almost entirely out of woolly mammoth bones. And we aren't just talking about a random pile of ribs thrown together in a panic. This was legitimate, calculated structural engineering. Picture this. Ancient builders used massive, heavy mammoth skulls and interlocking jawbones to create a dense, stable foundation ring on the permafrost. Then, they took the long, curved tusks of the animals and carefully arched them over the top, locking them together to create a rigid, domed roof frame. Over this intricate bone skeleton, they stretched heavy, thick animal hides, packing the bottom edges with earth and snow to seal out the biting wind. Inside, a central hearth was kept burning around the clock, usually fueled by animal fat and dry bone marrow, which actually burns far hotter and longer than standard wood. Stepping inside one of these bone huts from the -40-degree wasteland outside would have felt like walking into a sauna. It was a masterpiece of prehistoric survival, proving that early humans weren't just surviving the brutal environment, they were actively bending it to their will. But a mammoth-bone mansion is only helpful when you're safely zipped up inside it. Eventually, you have to go back out into the blinding whiteout conditions to hunt, forage, and gather ice for water. This brings us to another massive pop culture misconception. Movies love to show Ice Age humans wearing a single, ragged, raw animal pelt draped over one shoulder like some sort of prehistoric toga. Let me be perfectly clear. If you walk out into an Ice Age blizzard wearing a loose, drafty animal skin, you are going to freeze to death in a matter of minutes. Loose, unfitted clothing creates what survival experts call a chimney effect. The freezing wind sweeps up from the open bottom, pushes all of your precious body heat out through the top, and rapidly drops your core temperature into terminal hypothermia. To survive the deep freeze, humans didn't just need animal blankets. They needed high-tech, form-fitting winter gear. And to get that, they had to invent one of the most underrated, game-changing pieces of technology in human history: a tiny, fragile tool that completely altered our evolutionary destiny: the eyed bone needle. By carving a tiny, delicate sliver of animal bone, polishing it into a sharp point, and meticulously drilling a microscopic hole through the blunt end, ancient humans went from simply wrapping themselves in dead animals to becoming master tailors. They used tough plant fibers and dried animal sinew as thread to stitch together complex, multi-layered garments. We are talking about fitted trousers, tailored parkas with hoods, and snug, waterproof boots. They understood the science of thermal insulation perfectly. They would sew their clothes with a soft layer of fur facing inward against their skin to trap a vital pocket of warm air, and a tough, windproof leather layer facing outward to repel the snow and sleet. This wasn't just clothing. It was a wearable, portable microclimate. It allowed our tropical hairless species to venture out into the most hostile environments on Earth, safely insulated in their own personal pockets of tropical heat. With a secure base camp built from bones and specialized winter gear locked down, our ancestors were finally ready to face the absolute toughest challenge of the Ice Age: stepping out into the snow to secure enough calories to keep their internal fires burning. So, you're bundled up in your custom-tailored fursuit, stepping out of a warm mammoth-bone hut into the biting cold. Now what? Now, you have to eat. And not just a light snack. When you are constantly battling sub-zero temperatures, your metabolism runs like a jet engine on full afterburner just to keep you from freezing from the inside out. Modern polar explorers often consume anywhere from 6 to 10,000 calories a day just to maintain body weight. Our Ice Age ancestors faced a landscape buried under feet of solid snow, so foraging for leafy greens or sweet berries was completely off the table. They needed the most calorie-dense, high-octane fuel available in the natural world. They needed massive amounts of animal fat. This posed a rather terrifying logistical problem. The creatures carrying all that precious fat were the equivalent of biological tanks. Picture an adult woolly mammoth. We are talking about a highly intelligent, aggressive beast that stood over 10 feet tall at the shoulder, weighed around 6 tons, and was armed with curved tusks the size of tree branches. If you were a fragile human, armed with nothing but a sharp rock tied to a stick, running up and trying to poke an angry mammoth in the open was just an elaborate way to commit suicide. They couldn't rely on brute strength. They had to rely on extreme coordination and physics. First, survival hunting was never a solo mission. It was a highly synchronized team sport. Early humans realized that the treacherous landscape itself was their most powerful weapon. Instead of fighting megafauna on flat, open ground, a coordinated group of hunters would use fire, noise, and sheer intimidation to stampede a herd toward a natural trap. They would drive a terrified woolly rhino into a blind ravine, over a steep cliff, or into a hidden, unfrozen peat bog, where the massive weight of the animal would cause it to sink and panic. The terrain completely neutralized the animal's deadly speed and power. But even trapped, these giants had incredibly thick hides and layers of matted fur that could stop a standard thrusting spear dead in its tracks. To deliver a lethal blow from a safe distance, our ancestors engineered an ingenious physical cheat code called the atlatl, or spear thrower. Imagine a carefully carved piece of wood or bone with a hook at the very end. You lock the butt of your flexible spear into that hook. When you throw, the atlatl acts as an artificial extension of your arm, adding an extra joint and dramatically increasing your mechanical leverage. It takes the kinetic energy of a normal human throw and multiplies it, launching a dart at up to 100 miles per hour. That is enough force to punch right through the thick, leathery armor of an Ice Age giant. It was the prehistoric equivalent of a high-powered sniper rifle. Once the massive animal was down, the real prize wasn't just the steak. In extreme cold, surviving strictly on lean muscle meat can actually be fatal. It leads to a dangerous metabolic condition known as protein poisoning, or rabbit starvation, where your liver simply cannot process the excessive protein without a balance of fat or carbohydrates. To survive, Ice Age humans became utterly obsessed with fat. They would strip the thick layers of blubber to melt down for calories, but the absolute holy grail was hidden deep inside the animal's skeleton. Using heavy stone hammers, they would smash open the thickest leg bones to harvest the marrow. Bone marrow is rich, incredibly fatty, and packed with life-saving nutrients. It was the ultimate, nutrient-dense Paleolithic energy bar. It was this crucial, fatty fuel that kept their brains running and their internal fires burning. Yet, even with bone huts, tailored clothes, and genius hunting weapons, Homo sapiens were not the only humans fighting for survival out there in the freezing dark. In fact, if you were to place a bet on who would survive the Ice Age, based purely on physical strength and biological adaptation, you wouldn't have bet on us at all. You would have put all your money on a completely different human species, sharing that very same frozen wasteland. A species that, by all logic, should have conquered the ice while we froze into extinction. Meet the Neanderthals. If you were casting a movie about ultimate Ice Age survival, these guys would get the lead roles every single time. They were a parallel species of human that had been living in the freezing climates of Europe and Asia for hundreds of thousands of years before we even packed our bags to leave Africa. Evolution had perfectly sculpted them to handle the freeze. Compared to our tall, lanky frames, Neanderthals were short, remarkably stocky, and built like champion powerlifters. There is a simple rule in biology which dictates that animals in colder climates evolve compact, rounded bodies with shorter limbs. It is purely mathematical. It reduces the amount of skin surface area exposed to the air, meaning you lose drastically less body heat. Neanderthals were the living embodiment of this rule. They featured massive, barrel-shaped chests to house enormous lungs, and wide, projecting noses, designed to act as biological humidifiers, warming and moistening the freezing, dry tundra air before it ever reached their sensitive lungs. Their bones were vastly thicker, their muscles were denser, and their brains were actually slightly larger than ours on average. They were the undisputed heavyweights of the European icescape, surviving brutal close-quarters combat with megafauna. So here is the greatest twist of the Ice Age. If Neanderthals were physically superior, biologically custom-built for the cold, and possessed brains fully capable of complex tool-making, why aren't they here today? Why did they completely vanish from the fossil record around 40,000 years ago, leaving our fragile tropical species to inherit the frozen Earth? The answer lies in the most powerful, entirely invisible weapon we ever developed. It wasn't a sharper spear point or a thicker winter coat. It was our sprawling, chaotic social network. Archaeological evidence paints a fascinating picture of how Neanderthals operated. They were incredibly localized. When scientists dig up Neanderthal stone tools, the rock used to make those blades almost always comes from a local quarry, just 20 or 30 miles away. They lived in small, highly isolated family units, rarely venturing outside their familiar home territories. They were immensely tough, but they were completely on their own. Homo sapiens, on the other hand, were the ultimate prehistoric socialites. When you excavate the camps of our ancestors, you find decorative seashell jewelry hundreds of miles away from the nearest coastline. You find tools chipped from exotic volcanic glass that had to be painstakingly transported across treacherous mountain ranges. This tells us something monumental. Early Homo sapiens were constantly interacting and trading. And when you trade physical objects, you are also trading something infinitely more valuable: information. Picture a brutally harsh winter, where a local herd of caribou suddenly changes its migration route. For an isolated Neanderthal family group, a missed hunting season is a flat-out death sentence. They have no backup plan and no neighbors to lean on. But for Homo sapiens, a localized famine was a survivable setback. Because our ancestors actively traded, exchanged gifts, and intermarried with neighboring tribes, they built an extensive prehistoric safety net. If times got tough, they could call in a favor from allies living 100 miles down the valley. More critically, this vast social network functioned like a prehistoric internet. If a brilliant hunter in one tribe invented the spear thrower, or a clever toolmaker figured out how to precisely scarve an eyed bone needle, that cutting-edge technology didn't just die out when they did. It was shared, taught, and aggressively copied across the entire landscape. A single Neanderthal group was like a highly robust, standalone computer. It was tough, but its hard drive was strictly limited to its own experiences. Homo sapiens, however, were hooked up to the cloud. We actively combined the brain power, trial and error, and survival hacks of thousands of individuals spanning across entire continents. Our ultimate survival mechanism wasn't physical durability, it was our social brain. By pooling our collective knowledge and refusing to face the deep freeze in isolation, our skinny, fragile species outsmarted the very extinction event that claimed our strongest cousins. We had officially secured our place in a hostile world. But as the long winter raged on, our ancestors weren't just content with simply scraping by. We were about to prove that human beings could find beauty in the darkest of times, and we were about to recruit a very unexpected furry ally to help us conquer the coming thaw. Picture the scene. You are sitting safely inside your mammoth-bone hut. The animal fat fire is burning hot, and your stomach is full of rich, calorie-dense marrow. You have conquered the cold. You have conquered the hunt, and you are connected to a sprawling network of other human minds. But as you look toward the entrance of your shelter, there is a set of glowing eyes reflecting the firelight just beyond the doorway. A few thousand years prior, those eyes belonged to a sworn enemy. But here, in the depths of the long winter, a brilliant and highly unusual truce was being forged. We often think of human beings single-handedly defeating the Ice Age, but the truth is, we didn't finish the fight alone. We recruited the descendants of the gray wolf. This wasn't a case of an ancient hunter simply snatching a puppy from a den and declaring it a pet. Evolutionary biologists believe it was a slow, cautious, mutual agreement driven by the extreme harshness of the environment. The bravest, or perhaps just the hungriest wolves, began creeping closer to human camps, drawn by the irresistible smell of roasting meat and discarded bone scraps. Over generations, the wolves that were least aggressive toward humans got the most food, and those friendlier traits were passed down. It was the ultimate symbiotic relationship. What did we get out of the deal? We gained a biological early warning system. While our ancestors had big brains and sharp spears, our human senses of smell and hearing are notoriously terrible compared to the rest of the animal kingdom. A wolf, however, can hear the crunch of snow under a cave lion's paw from an incredible distance, and they can smell a shifting herd of prey miles before we could ever spot them. They became our prehistoric burglar alarms and our ultimate hunting partners. We provided the fire and the projectile weapons. They provided the speed, the teeth, and the sensory radar. Together, humans and proto-dogs became an absolutely unstoppable apex predator alliance. But the true measure of our victory over the Ice Age wasn't just that we found a way to stay alive. It is what we chose to do with our extra time and energy. In a freezing, brutal wasteland, logic dictates that you should conserve every single precious calorie. You shouldn't waste energy on anything that doesn't directly contribute to finding food or staying warm. Yet, our ancestors actively chose to defy that logic. They chose to create art. Deep inside winding limestone caves in places like Lascaux, France, or Altamira, Spain, ancient humans crawled through pitch-black, claustrophobic tunnels. Using the flickering, unstable light of small stone lamps fueled by animal fat, they transformed the cavern walls into breathtaking prehistoric canvases. They ground up natural minerals like red ochre and black charcoal, mixing the pigments with water, saliva, or animal blood. With stunning artistic precision, they painted massive, sweeping murals of galloping wild horses, towering bison, and the very woolly mammoths they hunted. They also spent countless hours meticulously carving delicate Venus figurines, small, exaggerated statues of women crafted from stone or mammoth ivory, likely serving as powerful symbols of fertility, hope, and survival in a barren, frozen world. Why go through all this immense effort? This artwork wasn't just prehistoric interior decorating. Archaeologists believe these deep caves served as the first sacred spaces and the very first encyclopedias. The art was a way to record the changing of the seasons, to honor the spirits of the animals they relied on for survival, and to pass down vital, life-saving knowledge to the next generation. But more than anything, creating art was a defiant declaration of humanity. It was our ancestors looking into the terrifying darkness of the deep freeze and saying, "We are here, we are alive, and we are not just surviving, we are thriving." Eventually, the Earth's orbit and tilt subtly shifted. The global climate began to warm, and the long, brutal winter finally broke. The massive glaciers slowly, agonizingly pulled back toward the poles, entirely reshaping the continents and leaving behind a fundamentally changed planet. The towering woolly mammoths, the vicious cave cats, and the giant ground sloths couldn't adapt to this rapidly warming world, and they quietly faded into the fossil record. But we adapted. We shed our heavy furs. We stepped out of our bone huts, and we kept walking. The staggering ingenuity, the vast social networks, and the fierce, unbreakable resilience forged in the freezing crucible of the Ice Age became the very foundation of modern human civilization. Every soaring skyscraper, every glowing smartphone screen, and every single step we have ever taken on the moon traces its direct lineage back to a group of shivering, naked apes who looked out at an apocalyptic blizzard and simply refused to surrender. You carry the DNA of the ultimate survivors in your veins right now. Think about that incredible legacy the next time you find yourself complaining about scraping the frost off your windshield on a cold winter morning. If you enjoyed this journey back into the darkest depths of the deep freeze, make sure you hit that subscribe button and leave a like on the video so we can keep uncovering the greatest mysteries of our past. Let me know down in the comments which Ice Age survival tactic you think was the most genius, or which one you think you could actually pull off yourself. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring our incredible human story.